What would be a story you wouldn't write on John McCarthy?
Well, I think it was a story that you wrote, Jason, for Sure Dog, right? Did you write the one about Nevada not wanting to
Oh,
give him
yes.
his license again?
Right, right.
So that was a story where I had to stay away from it. I was aware of it. John told me for the book, and it was a story that I had to, I made the choice to stay away from, and the Sure Dog editorial staff agreed with me, and thought it was best for me to pass that story on to someone else, and I
Right.
think you're the one that did it.
But
So
but so in terms of getting access, I think that's always the trade-off that journalists we need to be wary of is that you get more access to a person, maybe the coverage is a little bit more humanized, but every writer has had a subject that they like to talk about or write about. But the paradox, I guess, is the more that you know about them and the more access you get, the less likely maybe you are to write, things about them that aren't as flattering. And that's always and that's the thing that I think a lot of fighters have understood and worked to their advantage, which they should. That's their incentive. And yet journalists you can get caught up in that a little bit because, I mean, they're human beings and have their own failings.
yeah, it's definitely a balance. This past Monday, Monday and Tuesday, I wrote two articles about Randy Couture, and the book came out in 2008. We stopped working on it in, I'd say, January 2008. It went to the publisher. And so, we're now 3 years down the road since the book came out. And, I feel it's been enough time, enough space has been created where I can kind of jump back in and report on Randy Couture. Um, but yeah, I have this relationship with Randy Couture where he always calls me back. He always answers my phone calls. We worked on a project together for 3 years. He told me a lot of stuff that did not go into the book. There was a lot of stuff that I got to witness that for one reason or the other we didn't put into the book. And
Too
it's
why?
stuff.
Too saucy? Too crazy?
You know what? It's when you write a book, the easiest way I can explain this is the way I explained it to John McCarthy. As I said, there are going to be some things that happen, on this ride that we take for the next couple years writing your book. We're in the moment. Some things are going to seem so important and they like
Right.
absolutely have to be in the book. But then when you kind of look at the general big picture later on, we might not necessarily put them in the book because it's not the main thread. It doesn't fit. It's a little detail that's important at the time, but isn't important in the big scale of things. So I
Right.
think that's what happened with Randy. I saw, these little things would happen and I would take notes, and some of them went into the book and some of them didn't. On other occasions, he would talk about things where if we put them in the book, it might affect another person, in the
Right.
sports world. And that's his choice. He has to be careful about what he decides to put in and what he decides not to put in and reveal. So, those are the things I'm talking about. So there are some things, and there's just some things where I was standing next to him and things happened, and it's private things that he just wouldn't put in a book. It's not necessarily relevant, but it's super interesting. And those are things that I just have to kind of take to the grave with me, if you'll say. But this week I did write two Randy Couture articles, and for the first time in a very long time, possibly the first time in my 10-year career, I decided to write in the first person because I
Ooh,
do
the
have
first
this
person monster.
because I do have this relationship with Randy, and there were so many little things that I really wanted to share with the audience about him because I don't think people will argue too much with me that he is just this really unique fighter that's come through this sport. And, for forever, for the history of this sport, I think announcers and commentators and other writers will compare contemporary fighters to him, in different ways. Whether they say, this reminds me of Randy Couture, or, I kind of the same reverence that Muhammad Ali gets, right, at this
Yeah.
point. Who,
No,
by the
and
way,
yeah.
ironically, is not like Randy. He's a controversial figure, right? When he was in boxing, he was controversial. But, all that's kind of over the process of time, big picture, Muhammad Ali is kind of the most well-known name in boxing, outside of the big guys now like De La Hoya and Pacquiao and all that, right? So that's kind
Yeah.
of the connection I meant with Muhammad Ali.
Well, the thing about Randy, I think, is that Randy came along at a perfect time. I mean, I remember actually I have to credit this to Josh Gross, who said in like 2003, he said we were talking about Randy against Liddell, their first fight, and Josh said he's the poster boy killer. And I never forgot that because he is the poster
Mm,
boy killer. He, beats Belfort. Then, I mean, going into that fight at UFC 43 against Chuck, I mean, I remember watching that. Do you remember Chuck's ridiculous ring entrance? That huge build up. He had this huge ring
Yes.
entrance, and it
I
was
don't
like,
blame Chuck for that. I
no,
blame the UFC.
right, right. I mean, it was like Randy gets like some music and comes in, and then like there's this whole light show, and it's like I was like, wow, I guess Randy's just gonna get killed, and I thought he was too because Chuck was completely unbeatable at that point. Decimates Liddell. Has huge wins against guys like Gabriel Gonzaga comes back and beats Tim Sylvia. So Randy really occupied a unique space in time by getting those big wins and being the poster boy killer. And I think his legacy can stand on that alone. So good stuff on
Yep.
Randy Couture. What now? Let's talk about. You did a forum recently. Was it Women in American Sports Media, touching on the much
Yeah,
dreaded.
it was the Association for Women in Sports Media, which was established in 1987, I believe.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that's right. So I guess we're over, if I do my math, we're there, it's over 20 years old, and hundreds of members, which is great. Until they reached out to me after the Dana White rant video in 2009. I didn't even know this organization existed, and I was surprised to see that there are a lot of women in all the different sports writing. And I'm now a member of this association, and I'm pretty sure I'm the only mixed martial arts journalist, female
Safe bet.
journalist in this organization, or at least the first. Uh, Actually, no, that's not true. The Sports Illustrated editor for a while, her name was Nikki, although she's no longer doing MMA. She was the editor for a bit, and she's probably the first member that had a position in MMA. So maybe I'm the second. But anyway, yeah, I've been talking to them, ever since the the Dana White slash UFC slash Zuffa decided that they're not going to credential me for Strikeforce events, which basically locks me out of all the big fights that everyone wants to see at this
Right.
point.
So what did
And
what did you guys talk about? I mean, did they talk about that in
well, we
other
talked
sports
about,
or?
yeah, well, the topic was women breaking gender barriers in sports, obviously. And I was on a panel with a wide variety of women. There were five of us. There was a very famous softball player who, pushes for women to play baseball essentially and not softball. There was
Interesting.
a basketball figure. She was, heavily involved. I think she was the first woman who was able to try out for an NBA team.
Ann
Um, sh
Myers?
yes, she was
Yes.
on the panel.
I remember she tried. I think
Yeah,
she tried out for the
you know,
Pacers. It was on like 60 Minutes.
that's awesome. But women that have had different trials and tribulations in the sports that they represent. Obviously, they don't they mixed martial arts is such a new sport, so they understand there's obviously a lot of testosterone going through this sport. They, the AWSM, which is called awesome, by the way.
Nice.
That's how they pronounce it.
Nice.
Is they're aware that I've had these issues with Dana White. Like I said, they reached out to Dana in 2009 after the video and asked him to take action, which was essentially they wanted him to apologize for his misogynistic comments, and Dana didn't respond to them. So when I let them know that 2 years later I'm still getting hassled and Dana White does everything in his power to make me look bad and on the big platform that he gets, and that there's been some behind the scenes stuff as well. I think that it's really impeded my career in journalism. The Awesome was very interested and wanted to lend me their support. So I got on this panel and I kind of, as quickly as I could and as fairly as I could, kind of described this whole thing with Dana White. And, the initial reactions from these women are like, why is he not held accountable? How can he do stuff like this? I don't understand. And like I said, I was honest about it. I said, it's not just me who's banned, it's a lot of male journalists as well. But, the thread that we all share is that we've all written things at one time or another that's upset Dana White. And I think to make sure that the other journalists don't go there, he punishes us. So the other ones stay in line. And, and I said, there's a real atmosphere of intimidation in the sport at this point with the MMA media.